Every morning, over 1 billion children walk into a building. They sit in rows. They open books. They wait for a bell to ring. We call it school. We think it's normal. We think it's always existed. It hasn't. For most of human history, no child ever sat at a desk. No teacher ever stood at a chalkboard. The idea of school as we know it is barely a few thousand years old, and the story of how it was invented is stranger, darker, and more fascinating than you would ever guess. This is the story of how humans decided that children needed to be taught not by their parents, not by their tribe, but by strangers in buildings on a schedule, and how that single idea reshaped the entire world. 50,000 years ago, there were no teachers, there were no classrooms, there were no report cards. Children learned by watching. A boy learned to hunt by walking beside his father. A girl learned to weave by sitting beside her mother. Knowledge passed from hand to hand, from voice to ear. Around campfires, under open skies. This was education, but it wasn't school. It had no walls, no schedule, no stranger standing at the front of the room. For 10,000 of years, this was enough. Humans didn't need reading, they didn't need writing, they needed survival skills, and survival skills were best taught by the people who loved you. Then, around 5,000 years ago, something changed, something that would make the old way of learning no longer enough. That was something writing. In ancient Summer, in the land between two rivers, a new kind of society was being born. Cities were growing, trade was expanding, grain had to be counted, taxes had to be recorded, laws had to be written down, and suddenly there was a problem no parent could solve at home. Someone had to learn how to write. Around 3000 BCE, the Sumerians invented cuneiform, wedge shaped symbols pressed into wet clay. It was complicated, it could take years to master, and so, for the first time in human history, specialized buildings appeared where these single skills was taught. They were called eduba, literally tablet house. Picture a small mud brick room. Rows of boys sit on the floor, clay tablets balanced on their knees. A teacher called expert walks between them with a wooden rod. The boys copy the same symbols again and again, hour after hour. We know exactly how harsh this training was because the students complained about it in writing. Clay tablets have survived describing beatings for lateness, beating for bad handwriting, even beatings for talking too much. One student wrote that he was struck for things he didn't even done. This was the very first version of school, and already it had detention, it had discipline, it had homework. But it wasn't for everyone. Only the sons of wealthy families attended the Iduba. Girls almost never did. This wasn't education for its own sake, it was training for a job. These boys would become scribes, the bureaucrats of the ancient world, the only people who could read a contract, write a letter, or record a king's decree. School wasn't born from a desire to make children smarter, it was born from a society's need for skilled workers. While Sumer trained its scribes in mud brick rooms along the Nile, Egypt was building its own version of the same idea. Egyptian scribal schools were often attached to temples or the royal court. Boys as young as 5 began training, copying hieroglyphs onto broken pieces of pottery called ostracea, since papyrus was too expensive to waste on beginners. An old Egyptian text used to encourage students, put it bluntly, a scribe's life was easy, while a farmer's life was filled with suffering. The message to Egyptian boys was clear: learn to write, and you escape the life of hard labor. The reward for education, even 4,000 years ago, was the same reward we promise children today: a better life. But in Egypt, just like Sumer, this better life was reserved almost entirely for boys from certain families. School was not a right, it was a privilege and a tool of power. Whoever controlled education controlled who could rise in society. Now, we arrive at a civilization that would give us the very word we use today. In ancient Greece, wealthy families hired a paedagogus, a slave whose job was to walk children to their lessons and watch over their manners. From this word, we eventually get pedagogy, the art of teaching. But it is another Greek word that changed history forever school. It meant leisure, free time, time not spent working. To the Greeks, learning wasn't drudgery, it was what free men did when they weren't farming or fighting. Philosophy, music, athletics, debate, these were the marks of a cultivated mind and they required something most people never had spare time. In Athens, boys from privileged families studied, read, writing, music, and physical training. In Sparta, education looked completely different. Brutal military training designed to produce soldiers, not philosophers, starting around age 7. And then came a man who would take the Greek idea of school and turn it into an institution. Plato founded the academy around 387 BCE, a school for advanced study just outside Athens. His student Aristotle later founded his own school, the Lyceum. These weren't schools for young children, they were centers for higher learning, for debating ideas, for teaching the next generation of thinkers. The Greeks had planted a seed, education as something valuable in itself, not just training for a job. But this seed grew in narrow soil. It was almost entirely for free born boys, girls, and the enslaved were shut out. Rome borrowed heavily from Greece and built something more structured. Roman children from wealthier families might progress through stages. Around age 7, they would start with a ludus, a primary school often held in a simple rented room, sometimes even outdoors, learning to read, write, and do basic arithmetic. The word ludus itself meant play or game, an oddly gentle name for schools that Roman writers described as strict and sometimes harsh, with discipline enforced by teachers who did not hesitate to use a cane. Students who continued would move to a grammaticus, studying literature and language in more depth. The most privileged, aiming for careers in law or politics, would finally study with a rhetor, mastering the art of persuasive public speaking, the essential skill for anyone hoping to succeed in Roman public life. Rome had built something new, a layered multi stage education system, stretching from childhood into early adulthood. But like every civilization before it, this ladder was almost exclusively climbed by boys from families who could afford to pay. For the vast majority of people across the ancient world, farmers, laborers, the enslaved, and nearly all women, school simply did not exist. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, much of its educational structure collapsed with it. For centuries afterward, formal schooling in much of Europe survived mainly in one place, the monastery. Monks needed to read scripture, so monasteries and cathedrals began running schools, first to train future monks and priests, and eventually, in some cases, to teach the sons of nobility as well. These medieval schools were nothing like Roman ones. Classes were often held in cold stone rooms. Students memorized Latin texts through repetition and recitation. Physical punishment for mistakes was common and considered a normal part of teaching. Meanwhile, in a very different part of the world, Education was flourishing in ways Europe hadn't seen in centuries. In the Islamic world, from Baghdad to Cairo to Cordoba, institutions called madrasas taught law, theology, medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, at its height, was one of the greatest centers of learning on earth, drawing scholars who translated and preserved texts from Greek, Persian, and Indian traditions, knowledge that might otherwise have been lost forever. While parts of Europe had narrowed their focus to religious memorization, the Islamic world was expanding the very idea of what a school could teach. For thousands of years, one thing had limited how many people could ever attend school. Books were incredibly rare and expensive. Every single copy had to be written by hand. Then, in the 1440s, a German goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg built a machine that would break that barrier forever, which is the printing press. Suddenly, books that once took a monk months to copy could be produced by the hundreds. The price of knowledge collapsed, and for the first time, mass education wasn't just a nice idea, it was actually possible. The Protestant Reformation added fuel to this fire. Reformers like Martin Luther argued that ordinary people should be able to read the Bible themselves, not rely entirely on priests to interpret it for them. If people needed to read, people needed schools. Slowly, across parts of Europe, the idea began to spread. Maybe education shouldn't just be for the elite. The idea of mandatory state organized education for ordinary children, not just the wealthy, is astonishingly recent. In the 1760s and 1770s, the Kingdom of Prussia began building one of the first organized government run systems requiring children to attend school. The goal wasn't purely generous. Prussia wanted literate soldiers, obedient citizens, and a population that could serve an increasingly organized state. The Prussian model was strikingly similar to what you would recognize today. Children grouped by age, a fixed timetable, a curriculum set by the state, not by individual teachers, bells marking the change between subjects. It worked with terrifying efficiency, and other nations noticed. As the Industrial Revolution transformed Europe and North America in the 1800s, factories needed something new. Workers who could follow instructions, read basic science, do simple arithmetic, and crucially show up on time every single day. Sound familiar? Reformers in the United States, particularly Horace Mann in the 1830s and 1840s, pushed hard for common schools, free publicly funded education for all children regardless of family income. The goal was to create informed citizens for a democracy and workers ready for an industrial economy. By the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, many countries across Europe and North America had passed laws making school attendance compulsory for young children. For the first time in human history, school wasn't a privilege for the elite few, it was becoming something every child was required to do. The school you would recognize rows of desks, a chalkboard, a bell, separate grades by age, a fixed daily schedule, crystallized largely during the Industrial Revolution, and that's not a coincidence. Many historians have pointed out how closely the structure of an industrial era school resembles the structure of an industrial era factory. A bell signaling shift changes, workers or students organized into standardized groups, a supervisor at the front, and an emphasis on order, punctuality, and reputation. School had been reinvented once again, this time to serve a world of machines, assembly lines, and mass production. Through the 20th century, education kept expanding. More countries made schooling compulsory. More girls gained access to classrooms that had excluded them for millennia. Higher education, once reserved almost exclusively for elite men, slowly began opening its doors wider. The journey from a single mud brick room in ancient Sumer to a global system educating over a billion children had taken 5,000 years. Here's the truth most of us never stop to consider. School is not natural, it is not something written into human biology, it is an invention built, rebuilt, and reshaped by every civilization that needed it for reasons that were often more about power, religion, or economics than about curiosity or joy. It began as scribe training for the wealthy few in ancient Mesopotamia. It became a mark of freedom and leisure in Greece, a layered system of privilege in Rome, a tool for religious survival in medieval monasteries, a weapon of mass literacy after Gutenberg's press, and finally an instrument of the state and the factory in the modern age. Every single feature you take for granted, the desk in rows, the bell between classes, the grading by age, even summer vacation, originally timed around the harvest season, is a fossil, a leftover decision made by people solving problems that, in many cases, no longer exist. So, the next time you walk past a school or remember sitting in one yourself, ask a different question, not why do I have to go to school? Ask this instead: if we were inventing school again today from scratch, would we build it the same way?